Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. Thanks to Nathalie Binczek, Armin Schäfer, and to Ida Brückner, Ann-Caroline Hartwig, and Matthias Preuss. It's really, it's great to be here. And well, I think I'm a little bit too long. I probably will speak around 30 minutes, but I'll do my best. Over the next 20-25 minutes, I will offer some reflections on the novel around 1800, which are part of a larger generic poetical study that investigates the connection between the form, which is to say the formlessness of the novel on the one hand, and the representation of the possible, which is observable in both the novel's form and content on the one hand. On the other hand, taking the Aristotelian definition of dynamis as a starting point, one can distinguish between two types of possibility. I can't move this. Okay. First, possibility as contingency. Here, dynamis is conceived as part of the conceptual pair reality-possibility. This is the set of issues captured in Leibniz's concept of the visible worlds. And then there is, okay, so how can I have several points here on the slide. Okay, now it's working. So the second one is possibility as potential. Here, dynamis is understood as part of the conceptual pair potential action, potentia actus. In modernity, this dimension of dynamis unfolds along the forms of subjectivation that give rise to the modern individual. It determines our interest in the human faculty of the soul and the idea of perfectibility. The fact that and the way in which these two forms of the possible become intertwined in the novel around 1800 is in turn related to the particular lack of form that distinguishes the novel as a genre. And here again we have two aspects that will guide our discussion. On the one of the central characteristics of the novel is its worldliness. What renders the novel a modern genre is the fact that it ceases to depict something in the world. That is, it ceases to imitate the world and instead actualizes a world. Opens up a world, as Hans Blumberg puts it in his well-known essay, The Concept of Reality and the Possibility of the Novel. The novel thus constitutes the genre that carries out in exemplary fashion the process by which modern art has gained its autonomy. It also constitutes the very form in which the modern experience of contingency is made visible. By no longer imitating reality, but actualizing a possible world, the novel demonstrates that reality itself is contingent, that it is only one possible world among others. The modern novel is capable of depicting the intricacy of social complexity and its contingency. It creates a world governed by chance, thus providing access to a contingent reality. In doing so, it does not follow a given form, but rather acquires it through the actualization of a world. It is the life that takes place and unfolds in it that gives the novel its form. And this brings me to the second point. It is due to its lack of form that the novel produces its own theory, so to speak. It observes and it reflects upon the very processes of formation that give rise to its form. The novel not only opens up a world, but at the same time reflects on the condition under which this world comes into being. It refers back to itself as a medium and reveals the narrative forms through which it is constructed. What I would like to show in what follows is the fact that these four aspects, the two forms of the possible, the novel's worldliness, and its theoretical reflection on its very processes of formation carried out in it, are somehow all rooted in Leibniz. His reflection on theodicy and on the concept of possible worlds, along with his mathematical reflections on series formation and infinitesimal calculus, provide the essential elements that facilitate the poetic treatment of the possible in the novel around 1800. I will demonstrate this in, well, let's see, doesn't work again, here, in, well, 2, 3, or 4 steps. This depends on my time management. Probably only the first 2 steps, Leibniz and Goethe. So I'll start with Leibniz' Theodicy, the Palace of the Fates. The brief story Leibniz recounts at the end of his Theodicy is familiar, yet it is quite complex when looked at from a narratological point of view. Leibniz first relates a fictional dialogue by the 15th century Italian humanist Laurentius Valla, in which the latter discusses the question of free will. The story concerns the historical figure Sextus Tarquinius, the aspirant to the Rome throne in the 6th century BC, who raped his friend's wife Lucrezia. These events ultimately led to the rebellion against the Roman monarchy and to Sextus' expulsion from Rome. In Valla's account, Sextus consults Apollo at Delphi only to then complain about his predicted fate, whereupon Apollo refers him to Jupiter. It is at this point that Leibniz carries the dialogue further, having Sextus approach Jupiter to ask him, "Why have you condemned me, O great God, to be wicked and unhappy? Change my lot and my heart, or acknowledge your error." Jupiter does not change his heart, but gives him the option to not go to Rome and thereby escape his fate. But Sextus refuses the offer, and so the original course of the events is resumed. Up until this point, we find ourselves, as Bernhard Sieger has pointed out, in the setting of tragedy. Sextus rebels against the gods. But Leibniz further modifies the story with a change in narrative perspective and with it, generic scheme. He introduces Theodorus, the high priest, who asked Jupiter why he did not give Sextus a different will. In response, Jupiter sends Theodorus to the temple of Pallas Athena, where he dreams of meeting Athena, who leads him to the palace of the Fates. With Theodorus, Leibniz introduces the perspective of an observer, a reader of the scene, which from this moment on begins to unfold as a narrative in which Athena assumes the narrator's position. She tells Theodorus, "You see here the Palace of the Fates, where I keep watch and ward. Here are representations not only of what which happens, but also of all which is possible. Jupiter, having surveyed them before the beginning of the existing world, classified the possibilities into worlds and chose the best of all. I have only to speak, and we shall see a whole world that my father might have produced, wherein will be represented anything that can be asked of him, and in this way one may know also what would happen if any particular possibility should attain unto existence." What is then presented to Theodorus and to the reader through words is the famous image of the pyramid, open at the bottom and consisting of an infinite number of chambers, each containing a world perfect in itself. But at the top of the pyramid, there is the real world, representing the best of all possible worlds. So in a kind, Athena and Theodorus are like what Maria Cordial told us about the presenter in the virtual reality. So we are going now into these chambers in the narration. On the one hand, this episode gives insight into the condition of the divine. Jupiter, in his omnipotence, has already created, surveyed, and chosen the best of all possible worlds. On the other hand, we learn something about the way in which this world is mediated, for it is Athena's words that create the possible worlds for Theodorus. And at the same time, she reveals us how the representation of such a perfect world can be realized narratologically, for she draws on 3 different yet intertwined media: image, text, and numbers. According to the text, she leads Theodorus into one of the chambers. When he was within, it was no longer a hall, it was a world. In this world, Theodorus encounters Sextus once again, but he does not go to Rome. Instead, he cultivates a small garden, finds a treasure, and becomes incredibly rich. Theodorus saw the whole life of Sextus as at one glance and as in a staged representation. There was a great volume of writings in the hall. Theodorus could not refrain from asking what that meant. It is the history of this world which we are now visiting, the goddess told him. It is the book of its fates. You have seen a number on the forehead of Sextus. Look in this book for the place which it indicates. Theodorus looked for it and found there the history of Sextus in a form more ample than the outline he had seen. Put your finger on any line you please, Pallas said to him, and you will see represented actually in all its detail that which the line broadly indicates. From a narratological point of view, this is the decisive moment of the episode, since it is at this point that two different sets of relations meet. On the one hand, it becomes clear how the particular worlds are internally organized. Every possible world, and this is also true for reality as the best of all possible worlds, consists of an infinite multiplicity of series of facts. We have one series, that is Sextus' life, then we have other series of other peoples and other events, so infinite series of events, which means that every event is related to a course, or put differently, is organized in a causal manner. However, the nature of the interconnections between the overlapping, converging, and diverging chains of events, that is, the network of relations arising from them, is only intelligible in its logical totality to God. It is in this sense that Leibniz speaks of truth of fact, Tatsachenwahrheiten, as true statements whose negation is not a contradiction. They are not absolutely necessary but contingent. Only God knows their final course. The world contains all these chains of events that are composable with each other. And it is God who chooses from the abundance of possible worlds the one which exhibits the greatest possible perfection, providing maximum variance while maintaining maximum order. This is the criteria for the best of all worlds. So we learn how the world is organized in itself, and at the same time, we gain insight into the relation between the possible worlds. They are all different, though they do not strictly contradict each other. In this model, chance becomes a relational quantity. It represents a contingent event, which on the one hand is part of a continuous series of events that are composable and compatible with it, occurring in the same world. On the other hand, each event points to its intersection with all other incompossible events, that is, to divergent series of events, in other worlds in which the event would have unfolded differently. Thus, to a certain extent, every event carries within itself the abundance of its unrealized possibility. The story, and this becomes crucial for the modern novel, is thus infinite in two senses. It is part of an infinitely divisible, ramified world. One can always add more details. The world is never fully determined. This is where Leibniz's interest in the infinitesimal reveals its narratological implications. We are looking at an infinitesimal expansion of the narrative. At the same time, it is infinite in that each contingent event refers back to the abundance of possibilities from which it is actualized. And this brings me to Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre, and in particular to the famous initiation scene in chapter 9 of book 7, in which Wilhelm's admission into the society of the tower is depicted and his apprenticeship pronounced complete. As scholarship has often noted, it is at this point that the novel comes into itself, with Wilhelm holding in hand his certificate of apprenticeship, which epitomizes his life as depicted in the novel up to this point. But this scene marks more than the climax of the novel's plot. It also serves as a reflection on the very role of chance discussed at crucial junctions throughout the novel, namely during Wilhelm's encounters with the tower's emissaries. On the level of content, the initiation thus marks the turning point at which Wilhelm transitions, so to speak, from a theatrical character to a novel character, for it is the first time that he comes to the conclusion that, quote, what we call fate is really only chance. This is a stark contrast from his previous encounters with the emissaries, where he insisted that whatever happened to him was to be understood as a stroke of fate, in spite of the fact that the tower, in accordance with the novel's poetology, has always emphasized chance as a formative element. We see this as soon as Wilhelm's first conversation with a stranger about his grandfather's art collection, the sale of which Wilhelm interprets as the stroke of fate that made him discover that the theater as his true calling. I've always regretted the sale of the pictures and missed them often, even when I was older. But when I consider that it was necessary, so to speak, in order that I myself could develop a passion and talent of my own, which will affect my life more than all those dead pictures ever did, then I accept the fact and respect it as a stroke of fate, which opened up the best in me as it does in others. In response, the stranger emphatically points out that the, quote, texture of this world is made up of, quote, necessity and chance. Thus, the tower's emissary anticipates the novel's commentary on the difference between novel and drama, later made explicit in Book 5, when the theater company, in preparation of the formation of Hamlet, argues whether novel or drama should be ranked higher. It is agreed in this scene that the novel is the genre in which chance might be given free play, while fate is attributed entirely to tragedy. So, how does the novel, in terms of the process of formation outlined above, manifest the play of chance as a distinguishing generic feature? And how does Wilhelm's journey through life relate to the text's formation? In order to answer these questions, it is worth taking a closer look at the formal composition of the initiation scene in the tower, which alludes to Leibniz's story of the Palace of the Fates. In the initiation scene, Wilhelm finds himself in a hall which houses a multitude of scrolls which meticulously document the lives of each of the tower members, archiving the data it has collected for its experiment in social formation. Like the book in the chamber of Sextus, we find the scrolls and we also have a visual theatrical scene. The hall in which he now found himself seemed at one time to have been a chapel. Instead of an altar, there stood at the top of some steps a large table covered with a green cloth, and over it a drawn curtain, which seemed to cover some painting. Off to the sides were some finely wrought cupboards with wire grills, as in libraries, behind which were, instead of books, a large number of scrolls side by side. It soon becomes clear that the drawn curtain does not cover a painting, but a stage on which the various emissaries of the tower appear, one after the other, each of which Wilhelm had met at the critical junctions of his life. First, there's the stranger with whom he had spoken about his grandfather's art collection and with whom he had discussed the relationship between fate and chance. Second, there's the country priest with whom he had continued the discussion on fate and chance on a boat trip. The officer then makes an appearance, and finally, once again, appears the ghost from Shakespeare's Hamlet. This initiation scene, about which it is said, in terms quite analogous to Leibniz, that Wilhelm will come to know the small world that exists right here and how well known you are in it, can be read, if one relates it discursively to Leibniz's remarks on the best of all possible worlds, as a strategy for narrating contingency. In both cases, Goethe and Leibniz, the written word and the image form the media through which the world's contingency can be structured and made discursively accessible without resulting in undue reductions in complexity. By altering between the external perspective gained by looking at the theatrical scene and the internal perspective gained by looking at the scrolls, through which each scene can be elucidated in detail, the novel succeeds in opening up an inner world of the narrative infinitely as the representation of a world. Now, this world, in turn, is only one world among a multiplicity of possible worlds, each of which is causally organized in itself, yet incompossible with each other, and thus to be strictly separated, is demonstrated by Goethe's novel insofar as it no longer arranges the possible worlds spatially, as in the image of Leibniz's pyramidal palace, but by marking these worlds in their temporal extension. The reappearance of the tower's emissaries in the initiation scene invokes precisely those crucial junctures at which Wilhelm's real-life story, the one presented in the novel, reveals itself as a chain of causation containing within it, as its reverse side, a complex web of causalities pointing to the infinite possibilities of other possible worlds. However, unlike, for example, later in Jorge Luis Borges, which is also the example for Deleuze, these other incompossible worlds are not identified as part of the shared narrative universe. Rather, Goethe marks the junctures of the different series of events in the form of the emissaries. The four emissaries point to the junctures of Wilhelm's life at which it became clear that his life could have easily taken a different course. What the novel thus succeeds in doing is, on the one hand, reflecting on its own formation. It is here, in other words, that Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship comes into itself. On the other hand, the novel exposes the law of form associated with the narrative, namely the incessant distinction between actuality and potentiality. And it presents, in the reappearance of the tower's emissaries, the untold other, the incompossible possibilities that make form as their other possible in the first place. Meanwhile, Goethe's novel deviates from Leibniz in two crucial ways, and this is where the dimension of the potentiality comes in. On the one hand, the theological residue, which in Leibniz guarantees the inner stability of the narrative structure, is replaced in Goethe's novel by a politics aimed at gaining social control. It is no longer God who chooses the best of all possible worlds, but the tower, whose emissaries have, in the form of a controlled chance, ensured that Wilhelm renounces the world of theater, including the tragic idea of fate associated with it, and instead turns to the political and economic necessity of his time, a modern society characterized by functional differentiation. Tragic fate is thus replaced by a mechanism for gaining political control. On the other hand, it is no longer a third person who, as in the story of Sextus, gains insight into the world's laws of form by means of Sextus' life. It is instead Wilhelm himself who is confronted with his own life. The novel, which attains its form by giving form to a world, shows at this very moment that such a process of formation manifests in modernity as the formation of an individual life, the unfold of a life story that conveys itself to the individual by way of reflection. For Wilhelm does not revert to the tragic scheme of Sextus engages at the beginning of the episode in Leibniz Theodicy. Instead, he abandons the generic scheme in favor of the novel as he turns away from fate and towards chance. Both aspects are intertwined insofar as the modern history of sovereign subjectivity, which has found its most familiar literary label in the generic term Bildungsroman, is directly related to the political and economic aspirations for control in a modern society characterized by functional differentiation. The history of enlightenment, in which the Bildungsroman is somehow inscribed, has a biopolitical character, as one can see through an extension of Foucault. The modern subject is conceived of as an autonomous, self-determined individual, not least because modern societies can no longer be organized according to the juridical political program of the representative power of the sovereign and the formation of its subjects. Instead, modern societies, responding to their own increased complexity, strive to stimulate and regulate the individual's power, desire, and potential. In the course of the 18th century, the development of an individual's potential became a program for attaining social and political control. And the novel is the genre that most clearly reflects this change in literary form. It corresponds to this change in its laws of form by engrossing itself in the subject's formation, or more precisely, in the subject's latent potential and the ways in which that potential first gains form in the novel. Perhaps no one better understood that than Schiller, the relation between the reorganization of economic and state control in the face of a growing sense of contingency and the instrumentalization of the individual's potential in Goethe's novel. In his letter to Goethe of July 8, 1796, Schiller defines the goal which Wilhelm finally reaches after a long series of aberrations as follows. I will do this. He enters from an empty and undefined ideal into a defined actual life, but without thereby forfeiting the idealizing power. That he now passes over from the ideal to the real, from lively endeavor to action and a recognition of the actual without, however, losing what was real in that first state of endeavor, that he learns to confine himself within limits. That this I call the crisis of his life, the end of his apprenticeship. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the German original here, because dass Bestimmtheit erlangt, ohne seine schöne Bestimmbarkeit zu verlieren, is the important sentence here. So one can easily recognize in these remarks Schiller's commentary on the aesthetic state as the result of one's experience of a work of art, articulated in letter 20 of his letters on aesthetic education of man. There it is. In order to exchange passive against active liberty, a passive determination against an active, man must be momentarily free from all determination and must traverse a state of pure determinability. He has then to return in some degree to that state of pure negative indetermination in which he was before his senses were affected by anything. But this state was absolutely empty of all contents. And now the question is to reconcile an equal determination and a determinability equally without limit with the greatest possible fullness, because from this situation something positive must immediately follow. Schiller calls this state of perfect determinability the aesthetic state, a state in which the full abundance of the possible coheres in the instance before a renewed determination arises, a state in which man is, as we are soon reminded, zero, null. This insight is perhaps the most interesting of Schiller's entire theory, for in it lies the hidden potential of both anthropology and aesthetics. What Schiller discovers in Goethe's novel and pursues in his own aesthetics is the attempt to transpose aesthetic potential into social practice, so as to put its abundance to use for the gaining of social control. And yet in the fullness of the possible resides an element of uncontrollability inherent to literature, which resists transformation into a practical actualization that would conform to society. We might call this element the paradox of an active potentiality, a potentiality that becomes effective as such and imperils Goethe's and Schiller's project of the regulatory appropriation of the individual's potential. The novel expresses this explosive nature of pure potentiality in the figure of Mignon, who is accordingly killed off and buried in a marble coffin as an ancient work of art. Wilhelm himself does not subsist in the plenitude of aesthetic determinability, but moves towards actualization. And it is precisely on the threshold of these two modes that the novel operates, attaining its form as it reveals the potentiality of the individual forming within it. With regard to the tower, one could speak of a model for controlling the possible that aims at making use of this potentiality. With regard to the novel, this brings about what Blumenberg has called an aesthetic irritation, ästhetisches Ärgernis, the novel's reduction into a set form with a beginning and an ending, and thus the fixing of that which is potentially infinite and incapable of being closed off. Thank you so much for your patience. I was too long ago.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction and also for the kind invitation. My special thanks go to Nathalie Binczek and Armin Schäfer. It's great to be here, and I'm very excited to be part of the endeavor to think about virtual worlds from the perspective of literary studies, literary theory. And we now move to the 20th century, to Kafka's The Burrow, though I'm pretty positive that you will see manifold connections between the points which were emphasized in the introduction by Ida, Caroline, and Matthias, and also to Anja's intriguing remarks on possible worlds in Leibniz and Goethe. I would just think of all that could happen. Kafka's Burrow in the making. If anything can be said with certainty about Kafka's The Burrow, it is that it is in the making. The structure is in the making, the text is in the making, remaining a fragment, thinking is in the making. The processuality of Kafka's late narrative from 1923 sets in motion, the processuality that Kafka's late narrative sets in motion is a processuality of possibilities. It's the dynamic of the possible that leads to continuous revision, reconstruction, undermining of the burrow, or better, that is articulated in the making. Kafka's The Burrow is about exploring the thinking of the possible, Möglichkeitsdenken, in the context of the episteme of modernity. Oh, just think of all that could happen. Ach, was könnte nicht alles geschehen? This exclamation of the researcher animal concerned about the security of the burrow not only marks the alliance between thinking of the possible and modern knowledge production, but also raises the question of the epistemic status of literature. With the constellation of literature and the possible, the animal of the burrow finds itself in not altogether unprestigious company. Aristotle's, as well as Bodmer's and Breitinger's poetics, define poetry in relation to the possible as the poet's tasks of conveying what could happen as imitation of nature in the possibilities, thereby aligning thinking of the possible with the poetic process. The relationship between literature and possibility is articulated fully into a literary epistemology of the possible in the first third of the 20th century, with Kafka's work playing a prominent role here. What forms does the thinking of the possible assume in Kafka's The Burrow, and what epistemology emerges in it? I begin with an analysis of the poetics of possibility in Kafka's narrative, in order to thus examine the specific epistemic formation that the Burrow exhibits or represents, and which to me seems to be of particular relevance for the question of virtual worlds, namely suspicion. Suspicion as thinking of the possible in modernity. Let us begin with the multiple linguistic and poetic markers of the possibility in the text. The frequent use of the adverb perhaps, as well as the subjunctive, would be, if only he would come now, and so forth, is striking. The subjunctive also serves as an indicator of missed opportunities. It would have been possible. Further elements of Kafka's poetics of the possible are series of or, right, in the sense of this or that or another possibility or plan, meaning alternatives, as well as a multitude of assumptions or hypotheses concerning the cause of the noise, such as the small fry, the Kleinzeug, or the Hisser, der Zischer. And then there is the possibility that everything might be completely different, which is articulated already in the first sentence in the words, it seems. I fashioned the Burrow and it seems to be well done. Ich habe den Bau eingerichtet und er scheint wohl gelungen. The narrative repeatedly stages this possibility that everything might be completely different, in the words of Kafka's The Burrow, a complete reversal of the situation, die völlige Umkehrung der Verhältnisse. The most serious reversal of the situation is undoubtedly the inversion of the silence of the Burrow into incessant noise or hissing. The best thing about my Burrow, it reads at the beginning, is its silence. Of course, this is deceptive. At any time, the silence can suddenly be shattered, and then everything is at an end. A reversal of the situation also takes place in other respects, in relation to sleeping and waking, and as a reversal of the position of the observer and that of the observed. The corresponding passages read, I look for a good hiding place and stealthily watch the entrance to my house, in this instance from the outside, for days and nights at a time. It feels to me then not as if I were standing outside my house, but outside myself, while I am asleep and knew the joy of sleeping deeply and at the same time of being able to keep a close watch on myself. Ich suche mir ein gutes Versteck und belauere den Eingang meines Hauses, diesmal von außen Tage und Nächte lang. Mir ist dann, als stehe ich nicht vor meinem Haus, sondern vor mir selbst, während ich schlafe, und hätte das Glück, gleichzeitig tief zu schlafen und dabei mich scharf bewachen zu können. It doesn't take long for the situation to reverse, though. No, I'm not the one, though I thought I was, who watches me sleeping. Rather, I am the one who sleeps while the one who wants to deprave me watches. Nein, ich beobachte doch nicht, wie ich glaubte, meinen Schlaf. Vielmehr bin ich es, der schläft, während der Verderber wacht. The simultaneity of sleeping and waking, which promises the absolute observer's view, turns into the figure of complete surrender. In the reversal of the situation, as installed by the potentiality of the Burrow, what coincide are not only sleeping and waking, but also observing and not observing. The chiastic interconnection of mutually exclusive possibilities is commented on elsewhere in the text with the exclamation, how could that be possible? Wie wäre das möglich? Indeed, the potentiality of the Burrow, or the Burrow as potentiality, is not subject to Aristotle's theorem of contradiction. What is impossible to think for Aristotle, Kafka's Burrow practices with preference. This also has consequences for the possible, which in Kafka consistently leads into the impossible. where, for example, the animal could enjoy his time to the fullest and spend it without a care, it says, I could, and yet I cannot. I am too deeply occupied by my borrow. Vielmehr, ich könnte es und kann es doch nicht. Zu viel beschäftigt mich der Bau. Zu viel, too much, seems to be the formula that marks possibility as impossibility. I find nothing, or rather, I find too much. Ich finde nichts, oder vielmehr, ich finde zu viel. It's also said with regard to the noise in the second part of the narrative. Giorgio Agamben has shown that the possible in Kafka, as already in Aristotle, should be thought in terms of the impossible or impotentiality. Another companion in this respect is Kierkegaard, whereby the impossible is conceptualized differently in Kafka and Kierkegaard. For Kierkegaard, the focus on the impossible as paradox is the prerequisite for change, transition, metabole or kinesis. Dynamis, as the impossible, is oriented towards energeia. In Kafka, the orientation of dynamis towards energeia is precisely not to be found. Rather, Kafka's Burr is a setting for those conceptions of the possible, and here I quote, in which possibility is not primarily related to becoming real, Wirklichkeit werden. And I'm quoting from the volume Theories of the Possible, Theorien des Möglichen, edited by Anja, Lemke and Niklaus Lagier. Indeed, Kafka's The Burr can be understood as a text that contrasts both conceptions or interpretations of dynamis. What distinguishes the enormous force, the ungeheure Kraft of the Gegner, the enemy or the opponent, is the orientation of dynamis towards energeia. It digs day and night, always with the same force and vigor, the plan that dances before its eyes, demanding the swiftest possible execution, and it has all the skills needed to carry it out. Now I could never have anticipated such an enemy. Tag und Nacht gräbt es immer in gleicher Kraft und Frische seinen eiligst auszuführenden Plan vor Augen, den zu verwirklichen es alle Fähigkeiten besitzt. Nun, einen solchen Gegner habe ich nicht erwarten können. The potentiality of the Burr, however, is precisely not oriented towards energeia, Verwirklichung. If it is nevertheless accompanied by a performative dimension or dimension of action, then not in the sense of realization, but rather in the sense of performing possibilities as possibilities, which generates nothing but exhaustion. Exhaustion of the possible as well as physical exhaustion. The manifoldness of the Burr offers infinite possibilities for the storage of supplies, for example, their distribution in every third smaller chamber, or the designation of every fourth chamber as the main larder and every second chamber as a secondary reserve larder, or the elimination of particular passages entirely for the storage of supplies, or an erratic choice of only a few chambers. Each new plan or possibility must be performed physically as a possibility. Each of these new plans requires heavy hod-carrying labor. I have to recalculate the situation and then carry the loads back and forth. Jeder solcher neue Plan verlangt allerdings schwere Lastarbeit. Ich muss die neue Berechnung vornehmen und trage dann die Lasten hin und her. If according to Deleuze, Beckett's characters plays with the possible, exhausting the possible, and themselves without realizing it, this is also true to the animal in Kafka's The Burr. And now I quote from Deleuze. You combine the set of variables of the situation provided you renounce all order of preference and all organization of goal, all signification. You no longer realize, even though you accomplish, and you are not passive, you press on, but towards nothing. Deleuze's remarks on exhaustion in Beckett can be taken as a precise description of the potentiality of Kafka's Burr. Again, Deleuze, a sense or a penetrating science of the possible, joined or rather disjoined with the fantastic decomposition of the I, the greatest exactitude and the most extreme indeterminacy. These are the two senses of exhaustion, and both are necessary in order to abolish the real. If the enormous force of the enemy or the Gegner is characterized by realization, then it is just this orientation of dynamis towards energeia, of potentialitas towards actualitas, which threatens the borrower, threatens it as potentiality. Put differently, it's not about the destruction of the borrower, but about the destruction of the borrower as potentiality by realization. The potentiality of Kafka's borrower is situated in the context of the episteme of modernity, or more precisely, it shows the episteme of modernity to be one of possibility. The specific epistemic formation that comes to the fore here, i.e. what the borrower represents and exhibits, is suspicion. Kafka's narrative, thus my thesis, identifies suspicion as the sense of possibility of modernity. As might be expected in light of my previous remarks on the poetics of the possible in the borrower, suspicion is a tricky epistemic thing, which I'll analyze more closely in the following. In what sense can the borrower be described as a scene of suspicion? The borrower is a place of observation, an experimental arrangement, a recording system. In short, it's a production side of epistemic things, driven from the beginning by concern for the security of the borrower and increasingly occupied with tracing the origin of the indefinable noise the narrator animal is constantly making, now quote, observation. It conducts experimental excavations and half experiments. It entertains the idea of an experimental trench and Forschungsgraben. It changes the method of its investigation and registers or protocols its observations. The present tense of the narrative makes it possible to read these observations as an exempt protocol. Quote, I start on my investigation, I can find nothing, the same noise here, and so forth. Put differently, with this protocol-like style, Kafka's narrative cites a scientific system of recording, which in this citation is nevertheless transformed. In its meandering, labyrinthine course and its fragmentary end, the literary protocol withdraws the epistemic object or the object of knowledge as much as it produces it. The research methods of the animal gain contour in the context of the paradigm of clues. This is Carlo Ginzburg's famous wording of the modern human sciences, which, to use a phrase by Josef Vogel, can be called sciences of suspicion, Wissenschaften des Verdachts. What distinguishes the paradigm of clues is the production of knowledge on the basis of the interpretation of clues that are traced back to a cause and metaleptic causal inference. In his genealogy of morality, Nietzsche unfolds the causal interpretation in the context of ressentiment or resentment and analyzes it on the basis of the sentence, the lightning flashes, der Blitz leuchtet. For just as common people separate the lightning from its flash and take the latter as a doing, as an effect of a subject called lightning, so popular morality also separates strength from the expressions of strength, as if there were behind the strong an indifferent substratum that is free to express strength or not to. But there is not such substratum. There is no being behind the doing, effecting, becoming. The doer is simply fabricated into the doing. The doing is everything. Famous quote, you all know it. In its causal inference, resentment makes use of grammar, which aligns events or actions according to the order of subject and predicate, cause and effect. The doer is poetically added to and foisted on the deed, which means subsequently set as causal. This is the figure of metalepsis that Poleman analyzes in his reading of this passage. All voraussetzen ist Nachkonstruktion. The causal inference, which is characteristic of ressentiment, is exactly the kind of inference practiced by the sciences of clues, when they interpret the visible as an index and the index as suggesting a cause. Nietzsche sees this tendency of ressentiment in science, quote, "Our entire science has not got rid of the changeling slipped over on it, the subjects." Unsere ganze Wissenschaft ist die untergeschobenen Wechselbälge, die Subjekte, nicht losgeworden. Now, with the potentiality of Kafka's Burrow, this modern epistemology of suspicion undergoes a threefold shift. First, the investigations of the narrator animal, which seeks to locate and find the cause of the noise in accordance with the methods of the modern human sciences, all end in failure. The hissing noise resists all metaleptic efforts to determine the cause or the doer behind the deed, be it the Kleinzeug or the hisser, the Zischer. It systematically disavows such a causal conclusion. The Burrow pushes indexicality to the point where traces only refer to other traces, a disastrous undertaking for the science of traces or the paradigm of clues. In view of such an epistemologically shaken status of cause and causal conclusion, no certainty, Gewissheit, can be achieved either. The investigations remain on the level of the hypothesis or suspicion, which asserts itself primarily as a lack of understanding. If at first the narrator animal seems to understand immediately by ascribing the noise to the unsupervised small fry, soon this understanding gives way, as the thesis cannot be verified, to the categorical rejection of any idea of explicability. Faced, quote, with this phenomenon, my initial explanations fail completely, but other explanations that suggest themselves are ones I promptly have to reject as well. Vor dieser Erscheinung versagen meine Erklärungen völlig, aber auch andere Erklärungen, die sich mir anbieten, muss ich bald ablehnen. The suspicion figuring in this hissing noise interrupts understanding. It is at once a surplus and a nothing. I find nothing, or rather I find too much. Being a faint whistling, audible only at long intervals, a mere nothing, ein Nichts, the suspicion distinguishes itself by its groundlessness, einer Gegenstandslosigkeit. And yet it is this quality which does not afford peace, which does not stop bothering, which makes one go on with the search. But the noise does not let me be, I must go on searching, aber es lässt mich doch nicht, ich muss weitersuchen. In Kafka's text, the theory that both the narrator animal and the reader demand fails to materialize. Instead, we are left with the insolubility of the hypothesis, the suspicion. The end reads, but everything remained unchanged, aber alles blieb unverändert, das. Second, Kafka's The Burrow stages suspicion as an intersection of modern knowledge production and self-relation, of research activity and technology of the self. The suspicion of oneself is a prominent figure in Kafka's work and may well be called a modern version of the care of the self. Among Franz Kafka's texts from the Nachlass, we find the following note, quote, I've always had a certain suspicion of myself, but it happened only now and then, intermittently, long pauses were in between, sufficient to forget. They were trifles, meiner Dieters Geringfügigkeiten, that certainly also occur with others and mean nothing serious there, such as the amazement at one's own face in the mirror, or at the reflection of the back of one's head, or even of one's entire figure when one suddenly passes a mirror in the alleyway. Equal in origin to the narrative I, seit jeher, suspicion marks the condition of existence of the modern subject. The figure of self-suspicion is constitutive of the subject. Rimbaud's I is another undergoes a shift towards the variant of modern self-technology. I is the suspicious other. The suspicion of oneself takes place in a setting of self-observation, in which the medially doubled own body acquires the status of an index, face back of the head. The reflection of the back of the head testifies to a gaze impossible for the subject. In other words, in the observational scenario of self-suspicion, the gaze appears detached from the subject, shifted to a panoptic gaze. The animal in the burrow, too, is not exempt from suspicion of itself. Rather, the burrow is one of its production sites. Quote, "It is almost as if I were the enemy spying out a suitable opportunity for a successful break-in." Es ist schon fast so, als sei ich der Feind und spioniere die passende Gelegenheit aus, um mit Erfolg einzubrechen. Where the narrator animal itself appears as a suspected enemy, every investigation becomes the production site of suspicion of oneself. Where epistemology of suspicion and technology of the self intertwine, the investigating subject and research apparatus, narrator animal and burrow, suspicion and self-suspicion become indistinguishable. Third and finally, and here I resume my earlier reflections, Kafka's narrative stages suspicion as a radical sense of possibility, as that very possibility that everything might be completely different. Möglichkeit, dass alles andere doch auch ganz anders sein könnte. The potentiality of the burrow goes hand in hand with the already mentioned complete reversal of the situation, die völlige Umkehrung der Verhältnisse. Every measure taken to serve the security of the burrow appears in the next moment as its biggest threat. In order to monitor the burrow from the outside, it is necessary to leave it, which however might lure potential enemies on the trail of the burrow. The excavations made to locate the source of the noise potentially become acoustic self-betraying noises. The exit, place of the possible escape, is at the same time the point of the fatal vulnerability. There, at that point in the dark moss, I'm mortal. Dort an jener Stelle im dunklen Moos bin ich sterblich. Not even my exit will save me from them, the enemies of the inner earth, as indeed it probably will not save me at all, but rather ruin me. Vor ihnen, den Feinden im Innern, rettet mich auch jener Ausweg nicht, wie er mich ja wahrscheinlich überhaupt nicht rettet, sondern verdirbt. The burrow, or rather the protocol-like narrative which produces this, is an apparatic enterprise in which every calculus turns into its opposite. Every way out coincides with the hopeless dead, and every possibility with an impossibility. Some ruses, it says, are so subtle that they defeat themselves. Manche List ist so fein, dass sie sich selbst umbringt. By proceeding with such a ruse, the potentiality of the burrow generates suspicion, i.e. the constitutive moment of knowledge production itself as an epistemic thing, or rather an epistemic no-thing and unding that produces aporias and in doing so undermines any reliability of the episteme. If we want to think about virtual worlds with literature, the concept of possible worlds, we heard that, suggests itself a concept that, as I have shown, undergoes a specific podological and epistemological elaboration in Kafka's The Burrow. With modernity, possible worlds give way to use Josef Vogel's formulation, a world of the possible, which in Kafka bears traits of suspicion. What can be said about virtual worlds, which worlds of suspicion undoubtedly are? Virtual worlds which, as the abstract of the conference states, should not be thought in opposition to reality. They are, at the same time, possible as well as impossible worlds, worlds that enact a continuous reversal of the situation, worlds that might be completely different. As Kafka's note from the Nachlass shows, the worlds of suspicion emerge from trifles, from Geringfügigkeit, and they are worlds of latency that show themselves only in hindsight. Here and there, intermittently, this is again the quote from the Nachlass piece, long pauses were in between sufficient to forget. Similarly, Francis Iles, Before the Fact, the novel on which Hitchcock's the film Suspicion is based, described the genesis of Lina Eastgar's suspicion against her husband, Johnny. Suspicion is a tenuous thing, so impalpable that the exact moment of its birth is not easy to determine, but looking back over the series of little pictures which compose the memory of her married life, Lina found later that certain of them, a small incident here, its significance quite unnoticed at the time, an unimportant action there, perhaps just a chance word of a husband's, had become illuminated by her fear so that they stood out like a row of street lamps along a dark, straight road, a road which looks so easy in the daytime but so sinister by night. Virtual worlds of suspicion are structurally unreliable worlds, unstable, tenuous worlds that collapse as they establish themselves. To quote the title of this panel, the virtual worlds of suspicion are in the making. Suspicion is world making in the making, a making that is simultaneously an unmaking. Thanks for your attention.